Check.
Yeah, we're here. Hi, everyone.
Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome.
Beautiful rising.
Well, first off, I want to thank you all for coming today. It is such a pleasure to be here this morning with our brilliant and distinguished guest, Dr. Rachel Knox. Give it up for her.
Thank you. Thank you, Happy Monkey in Columbia, for having me.
She is the GOAT of cannabis. A leading specialist in cannabinoids and health equity, Dr. Knox has not only broken barriers in the field of medicine, but she has effectively pushed for social progress, using her platform and expertise to empower Black and brown communities devastated by the war on drugs. She is going to share some incredible insights today, including information that we can use to heal our minds and bodies, to destigmatize the use of cannabis, and to enrich our communities and small businesses. Dr. Knox will illuminate how neighborhoods like ours can flip the page from the war on drugs, turning cannabis from a source of problem into a source of strength, renewal, and economic power. Dr. Knox, thank you for being here with us today. It's my pleasure to now get into some of the questions. Can you talk to us about how cannabis interacts with the human body when it comes to health and wellness? What are the benefits?
Yeah, I'll get right to that, but I first have to take us back a little bit. Vlad, Fab, you talked a bit about history. I gotta take it all the way back. I will. Cannabis landed in this country, to our knowledge, around 1606. It has played an enormous part in building the wealth of our country. The Virginia colony, as early as 1619, was mandated to grow hemp because of how strong its fibers were. They used this plant to make clothing, sails, rope. The British Crown told the Virginia colony you had to grow it. So legislation was passed here, forcing every landowner to grow it. What also happened in 1619? First cohort of slaves landed in this country. And on record, we have presidents, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, acknowledging how difficult it was for men to break this plant and process it into the products that were so esteemed at the time. So who did it? They're slaves. It was Black people in this country that cultivated the earliest knowledge around how to grow and process and manufacture products from this plant. For hundreds of years, it was our folks. As a matter of fact, there's a historian who wrote a book about cannabis in Kentucky. Kentucky is historically, right, our hemp growing, our cannabis growing capital of the United States. And he quoted a Lexingtonian who said, "Hemp is a nigger crop," acknowledging that only the Negro, they said, was as knowledgeable in handling this plant. This is on record. We have the receipts, okay? Around 1850, cannabis wound up on our United States pharmacopoeia. Now, pharmacopoeias are texts that every country has acknowledging agricultural plants and natural medicines that are beneficial to the people, to the economy. So cannabis was on our pharmacopoeia until 1942. Cannabis was one of the top 3 drugs prescribed by licensed physicians in our country. Our biggest pharmaceutical companies developed cannabis products. I mean, you can go onto Google and look up, old medicine bottles, and you're gonna see cannabis Americana. You're gonna see cannabis cigarettes. Again, commonly prescribed, commonly available over the counter to American households, but it was called cannabis. Vlad, you mentioned the Marijuana Tax Act, right? Now, around this time, yeah, sure, Mexican Americans or Mexican immigrants were consuming, jazz musicians were consuming, and also on record was their recollection around why they were using it. Louis Armstrong has been quoted in saying that it made me feel better. It was hard for us Negroes. And there was nothing like smoking with a fellow tea, smoker. We were cultivating kinship at this time when we were, wholly oppressed. So that description is a therapeutic description, right? And so when I hear about the jazz musicians and Mexican immigrants exchanging and sharing in community this beautiful plant, we can't just chalk it up to recreational use. We can't. And I'll get into the science in just a second. But there were a lot of opposing interests around the time that cannabis was eliminated from commerce, from medicine, from industry. And none of them had to do with public health. It was all political, all economic. At the time, a popular magazine, even today, called Popular Mechanics, said hemp is the next billion-dollar industry. This is the 1930s, folks. The next billion-dollar industry with 25,000 and counting unique uses. It can make paper, it can make fuel, it can make materials stronger than steel, it can make medicines. You see where I'm going here? How many industries today would have been disrupted back then? They didn't care about the people. They didn't care who doctors were trying to help. When that Marijuana Tax Act came into being, and I don't even know if the American Medical Association themselves know this history. They opposed it. And today, they're working with lobbyists in states like Mississippi trying to prevent medical use from happening in the first place. But back then, they opposed it because their doctors prescribed it. They begged Congress to not go through with it, but to research the plant instead. Ignored. Couple last things I'm gonna say brings us right back here to New York City. Mayor LaGuardia in 1942 commissioned a report, worked with the New York Academy of Medicine to investigate the social and medical implications of the plant. And they wrote up a report that was released in 1944 that said that under any circumstances could they find evidence that cannabis was harmful or led to criminal acts like was being purported, right, throughout government at large. That one ignored, as you know, right? And so along with this Marijuana Tax Act, which really required anybody who wanted to use it, right, from cultivation to prescription and possession without getting the express, right, approval of the government. That's what this tax stamp would have afforded, any of us at that time if we wanted to use it. Do you think they handed it out? No, instead we found that cannabis was eliminated from the American Pharmacopoeia around 1942. So this is all happening at the same time. Yes, there was an intentional use of the word marijuana because it blinded everybody else, major stakeholders, from knowing exactly what they were beginning to prohibit. Y'all, we have to know this history. These are our receipts. With this sort of history, we can show up and explain exactly why social justice matters in this space. There is a lot of restitution to be had, right? There's a lot of compensation that needs to be provided to the communities of ours that have borne the brunt of prohibition, certainly, but really are responsible for creating the cannabis space culturally, right? Now that knowledge is wellness, okay? We have to stop thinking that the only way to consume cannabis is to treat a physical illness. Right? My family has coined the term infotherapy, right? And we feel like infotherapy is the cure to the misinformation, disinformation, and just sheer ignorance that communities have around the cannabis plant. So let's get to the science of it all. Let's fast forward a little bit. Researchers discovered the endocannabinoid system in 1988 with the discovery of the cannabinoid 1 receptor. Yep, we got receptors all throughout our body that accept molecules that are in this cannabis plant. Now, they discovered it because researchers wanted to know how THC worked specifically. And while our academic institutions were prohibited from researching the cannabis plant, they were able to study it because the FDA had approved a THC drug in 1985, just 3 years before. So yeah, the FDA approved a drug without even knowing how it worked. But they were able to use this synthetic THC, radio tag it, put it in a human body and see what it did, and it lit up this extensive receptor system. Within the next 5 years, we knew all the classical components of the most important system in the human body. And we've known about this system for 30 years. 30 years. I didn't learn about it in medical school. Most medical schools today still aren't teaching about it. The reason why, I think, is because it explains exactly how cannabis is medicine, and acknowledging that is gonna have to undo decades and decades and decades of systemic policies that have kept cannabis out of the conversation of medicine. But we're here now, right, where we have many, many states legalizing for medical use, many more, or not as many, but coming online for adult use. And I like to say that adult use is not recreational use. Adult use is the responsible and intentional discretionary use of cannabis. And if, for those of you who are consumers, I'm sure you use it for all sorts of reasons, right? You might use it recreationally or socially. That's just one type of use that an adult can choose. You might use it as medicine. You might use it for therapeutic or wellness purposes. Some of us might use it for spiritual and theogenic purposes, right? It's for Rastafarians, it's sacrament. And if you really do your homework, you're gonna recognize that cannabis was in that Bible too. It was a part of a lot of the sacraments throughout history, throughout Israel, and a whole bunch of other cultures the world over. But because we know about the endocannabinoid system, we have to know that every time we consume this plant, those cannabinoids are hitting receptors in our bodies, and there are downstream effects. So I'm an endocannabinologist. The physicians in my family also identify as endocannabinologists. We're not botanists, right? We're not doctors of the plant. We're doctors of people. People have endocannabinoid systems, so like a neurologist or a cardiologist, we're endocannabinologists. We study the function and dysfunction and modulation, right? How to treat dysfunctions of the endocannabinoid system. Cannabis is a major tool that works on this system, but other natural substances do as well. And I think knowing this is the single most important thing to the conversation around cannabis. If we really want to use this plant to heal ourselves, then we have to lead from a science-informed space. Now, to answer your question completely, cannabis is considered an adaptogen. What are adaptogens? Adaptogens are substances that balance our body, right? Reduce stress, harmonize. Things like ashwagandha you might have heard. Those are adaptogens. Functional mushrooms are adaptogens. Cannabis is an adaptogen. This endocannabinoid system that I mentioned that's most important to our body is responsible for keeping our body in balance. It works with every other system in our body. We call that biggest system the endocannabinoid dome. And there is research on not just cannabinoids, but the terpenes in the cannabis plant and how they work on this system in our body. Right, so let's take a few conditions: chronic pain, migraine headaches, PTSD, ADHD, autism. We are starting to collect more and more research on these disease processes describing how the endocannabinoid system is dysfunctional. Because of that, because we can explain how it's dysfunctional, we can begin to talk about how cannabinoids, THC, CBD, terpenes, pinene, limonene, linalool, et cetera, can work on that system to counter the dysfunction. Let me use a very simple example like vitamin D. Right? If you go to the doctor and they tell you that you're low in vitamin D, what do they give you? Vitamin D to supplement. We know that PTSD is an endocannabinoid deficiency, specifically in a cannabinoid our body makes itself called anandamide. THC behaves like anandamide. So before we go accepting that baloney that THC is the bad cannabinoid and CBD is the good one, it's THC, not CBD, that mimics anandamide. So like vitamin D deficiency, if we are deficient in anandamide, and THC acts like an anandamide, what might I, a clinician, prescribe to my patient? Bingo. Yes. Racial trauma is PTSD, right? It causes PTSD. The Black and brown community is underdiagnosed And there's a lot of reasons that we won't get into today, because I know there's more questions to get to. I had to paint the canvas here.
It's so important to appreciate the history, understand the history, and painting the picture.
This is the backdrop of this conversation, so I wanted to do that.
No, absolutely, Dr. Knox. Look, I have ADHD. I was diagnosed when I was a teenager and spent over a decade taking Adderall, which is an effective but pretty physically brutal drug, which I've stopped using, thankfully, last summer. It's been a difficult transition. What can cannabis do for someone like me or for others similarly situated?
Yeah, I'm gonna address that directly, but I'm gonna bucket some things just for brevity's sake.
Please.
In no way am I saying any of these conditions are equal, right? When we think of common childhood illnesses, conditions that are growing more and more pervasive, yes, we have ADHD, we have autism, we have seizure disorders, we have all sorts of other autoimmune disorders, right? And for some reason, we are perfectly comfortable prescribing drugs that have documented, well-known deleterious effects on the developing brain. You mentioned some of them. And some of these drugs give permanent, Okay, right? There are consequences to our prescription drug use. And starting use so young as in infancy for some of these conditions, why aren't we questioning their short-term, let alone their long-term effects? We don't. And I can tell you, we do not have enough conclusive evidence that cannabinoids, including THC, do. I'm not saying they don't. I'm saying we don't have conclusive evidence, right? So I have trouble when we're talking about the pros and cons of cannabis, and even when some of my colleagues are really apprehensive about using cannabis, but are all about prescribing these drugs that have known harms.
Short-term memory.
I have to scratch my head. And also mostly because we doctors are taught to, yes, weigh the pros and cons, but we're also taught to start low, go slow. We're also taught to, work with our patients, recognizing any adverse events, counseling patients on what to do when they observe or experience those adverse effects. You come back into the clinic and we figure things out. So to get back to your question, ADHD, is cannabis an effective treatment, or can it be for that? Well, I think, again, I like to show receipts. We have a number of states that have acknowledged that ADHD is a qualifying condition. They have determined there is sufficient evidence and safety to allow even young people to use cannabis as medicine to address it. I bet you we all know adults with ADHD who consume cannabis and for whom cannabis is beneficial. And yeah, I've had patients in my own clinics with ADHD who come in to consume. Thankfully, Oregon is an adult use state because ADHD is not one of our qualifying conditions at all. And that's unfortunate because we have the science to suggest that cannabis may be beneficial.
Thank you for sharing that. Speaking of which, you're a doctor, can you speak to any cases where cannabis has helped someone where pharmaceutical medicine has failed?
Listen, most patients wind up in a clinic like ours, or a cannabis clinic anywhere, because conventional Western medicine is failing them in some way. They might already be using cannabis and finding some benefit, or they're just fed up and want to try cannabis because they've heard, right? It has helped. Because of that, I can't say I've had a single patient for whom cannabis has not been beneficial. I have to say, though, it's not about our clinical care in this space, right? Cannabinoid medicine, endocannabinology is not about just giving you any old cannabis product, any strain. We call them chemovars in our space, and I'll explain why, but any old strain and think it's gonna work. We have enough knowledge, technologies to grow much more precise in how we recommend cannabis to patients for various conditions. Now, I mentioned before, cannabis is an adaptogen. It's highly anti-inflammatory, so it's not surprising that people feel better.
Yeah.
But oftentimes patients do come back wanting to feel even better. And what I mentioned before about having the science to suggest which cannabinoids and terpenes do what in what conditions, that gives us the latitude to make specific recommendations around cannabinoids, lead cannabinoids, whether that's THC or CBD or CBG or CBDA. I mean, I can go down the whole cannabinoid alphabet. We have much more research on some than others, but the whole point is that we can grow very precise, and sometimes there aren't strains out there that have the exact cannabinoid profile or terpene profile that we want, which makes the cultivation science, right, breeding, really, really important for our medical markets and our adult use markets. There was a research paper that came out recently called The Nose, also by Dr. Ethan Russo and Dr. A.D. Ray, where they described that when you can pick up and smell your cannabis, it's your nose that tells you what your body needs, and it had no correlation to THC level. So it wasn't like the more THC, the better the medicine. It's not the case, right? And actually, the more THC you consume, there's actually some diminishing effects as well. But it's all about that profile, and there might be a condition. You could have 3 conditions you want to address with cannabis. One of those conditions might require one product, the other 2 other products yet.
Thank you for that, and it leads me to my next question about potential diminishing effects. There is such a thing as too much of a good thing. So I do want to ask about what are the risks of cannabis use, and in particular, I know this is something a lot of parents worry about. What is the impact of cannabis on the developing brain?
So I've said the phrase pros and cons of cannabis a couple times now, and actually my family, Dr. Knox, we don't believe in that phrase, the pros and cons of cannabis. We firmly believe in appropriate use. And appropriate use also isn't binary, right? It's what might be appropriate for you this morning might not be appropriate for you this afternoon. And like you said, too much of anything can be a bad thing. It can. It's not always the time to use cannabis. Let me throw something else in here, though, right? So I'm in Oregon. We legalized psilocybin, too. And I can say there are instances where I wouldn't recommend cannabis, but another botanical or natural substance altogether, like psilocybin. Talk about racial trauma. We also have the evidence by research that substance can help with that as well. Appropriate use means intentional and responsible use. It means knowing why you're using cannabis when you pick it up. It means knowing what type of cannabis you use before you consume it, right? Whether that is, like I mentioned, for a social and recreational purpose, a medical one because you're trying to, address your PTSD or address your chronic pain or migraine headaches. Or a spiritual purpose. Know your why and make informed decisions about the products that you pick up. I also have to say you don't always have to smoke it, right? Inhaling cannabis, sure, that's a medicinal use, way to use medicinally. But let's challenge people when they start to challenge us by saying, isn't smoking bad? Explain that, well, we can use cannabis in all sorts of ways, right? We can, just to stay on the inhaling for a second, we can develop inhalers. We have inhalers in the market on the West Coast with cannabinoids. You don't have to combust at all. And you can get a fast-acting effect through inhaling, right? Going through the lungs, hitting the capillaries in the lungs, sends the cannabinoids into your bloodstream where they can be fast-acting. We can use tinctures. That's discreet. There's no smell. Just drop them under the tongue. Lozenges, capsules, edibles, topicals, transdermals. There's so many ways to consume cannabis. And all of those ways I mentioned are very common in medicine anyways. Talk about one way to destigmatize the conversation around cannabis as medicine. Using it does not always have to be associated with a smell or a cloud of smoke. So it comes down to appropriate use, timing, setting, and for what reason you're using it.
Yeah, I mean, when folks think about cannabis, it's often perceived as something that's just used smoke-wise. There's a lot of different consumptions that I think is important for the communities to be aware about, but also the effects of each of those consumption versions. Before I turn it over to the audience, I want to ask you one additional question, which is, we all know there's a lot of stigma around cannabis use, as well as a lot of misconceptions. And rightfully so, the stigma comes from the war on drugs, we know that. Mm-hmm. And so my question is, what do you believe we can do to destigmatize the use of cannabis in communities like this one?
Happy Monkey keep having events like this. And bring in to conversation everybody you can think of, every stakeholder you can think of. The reason why I'm in this space is because in no state, I mean, we don't have many people who look like me in my state. But even in my state, I recognize that there were no healthcare professionals involved in the conversation around cannabis regulation, and there were no Black people. So I said I had to do it, because I wanted to bring the receipts to the conversation that I just shared with you today. Yeah. I don't think we're having the right conversations. So bring everybody, because we all need to learn from one another. You said the time is now. In a lot of ways, we're playing catch up. I'm from Oregon, y'all. We've been legal for a long time. So we're behind. Like, we aren't even having conversations like this on a regular basis, and that's a shame too. But events like this pull in community organizations, which you've done, right? Pull in our esteemed academic institutions, which you have done. These conversations have to be conducted collaboratively. I think it's the only way that in real time we can have the intellectual conversations that are necessary to destigmatize internally, right, within our systems. And then beyond that, for those of you who do consume, share that information. Not just with your medical provider, but I think the more people we have who look like everybody, right? Young, older, those of you in here who are like, oh, nobody knows, and they wouldn't think I know too, because I'm a teacher, right? Or I'm law enforcement. No, we need you all to share your stories so that we can begin to see that cannabis consumers look like everybody, right?
Very, very powerful. We did not get to share this in the beginning of the program, but if you have any questions for Dr. Knox, there are index cards that Jesse is holding. We have a lot of questions I see for you, Dr. Knox. So if we can please get the index cards around to folks who have questions. If we have any questions so far, Jesse, we can ask those now, so I could proceed to an additional question.
Well, while we're waiting, you asked about the developing brain, and I didn't answer it. A lot of our research that has demonstrated harm have been in subjects who consume chronically, heavy, day in and day out. And when they've been studied, sure, we have been able to identify cognitive decline. What's been really interesting, though, even with those studies, within time, and maybe sure years of cessation, so after people have quit using, the cognition has improved, right? When we look at the research papers conducted on adolescents, for example, we're looking at people who are using chronically. We're not doing research on youth that identify as patients, right? Most people who consume cannabis for strict medical reasons aren't who these research papers have been conducted on, right? We also don't talk about what they're using, right? What cannabinoids were in that product. Cannabis isn't homogenous, and so I have a lot of criticism of these research papers. But what we don't, I like to use that word causation. We do not have definitive evidence that cannabis causes long-term deficits in youth who consume medically. We don't. And if you have any concerns, right? There are doctors like me who are available. We might not be that prolific just yet, but when in doubt, parents, right, look to someone like me to have that conversation with. I mean, a lot of parents are because they don't have the support of their clinicians, are making medical decisions on behalf of their kids all the time, and I think that's okay. But backup is necessary, I think, for a lot of folks.
Thank you for sharing that. Do we have questions ready to go? I want you guys to get the opportunity to ask questions. We're doing the index cards.
We have a process.
So I have one question for you, Dr. Knox. Talk about cannabis as a tool of health equity.
Oh, I love that question. Brevity isn't my thing. I'll do my best. Health equity is different than medical equity or patient equity, and I think unfortunately, the term is used to mean all of it. From some of my colleagues in the space, health equity really speaks to what like a healthcare system can do better to make sure that patients have, equal access to care and services. But when I think of health equity and think about all the things necessary to create good health of an individual or of a community, I'm thinking well beyond the medical system. So I'm the creator and co-founder of a movement called the Cannabis Health Equity Movement, CHEM for short. Our movement is made up of a couple of organizations that have launched and some that are coming online. The first is our Association for Cannabis Health Equity in Medicine. It's the one and only BIPOC medical association in the cannabis space. And then we have Chem Alliance, RC3, that is all around educating to what we call esteem. We want to boost esteem in our communities through teaching cannabis through the disciplines of agronomy, science, technology, engineering, art, model policy, and medicine. And we firmly believe that if we teach young people cannabis through this lens, then we can see Black and brown kids self-actualize into the opportunities that cannabis, between hemp and cannabis at large, afford us. Health equity, by our definition, is the assuredness of access to full health or well-being. In other words, prosperity. Health equity means total equity. Health equity challenges us to recognize that it's not just social equity we need to care about. It's not just economic equity that we need to care about. We also have to care about environmental equity. We also have to think about human equity and all of the things those things mean. So when we talk about making cannabis accessible through a health equity lens, we're not just saying, okay, great, which is important. We need more access to opportunities to provide medical cards. So important. It also means we have to increase the ranks of Black and brown healthcare providers like myself who can work with our community, because racial concordance matters. Black and brown people do better when they're cared for by Black and brown professionals, period. So we have to increase the ranks of us. But when you've gotten your medical card and you've gotten your cannabis and you even might have a medical doctor who looks like you, if you're gonna continue to go home into an environment that keeps you sick, what are we really doing here? But in our cannabis plant, this is what I think makes cannabis so special. Those 50,000 and counting uses of this plant between agriculture, industry, medicine, and nutrition, out of those 50,000 uses, we have 50,000 opportunities to innovate products that solve directly for the disparities that are contributing to our poverty and medical disparities. I have one more thing to say about that. But the only way we're gonna be able to actualize that is if we do the social equity part. And I gotta set the record straight everywhere I go. Social equity simply means fairness in policy and regulation. Social equity is not a program on the side. If the bills that create our regulatory markets aren't equitable, we have no social equity and we will never get it. On to that.
I have another question. Are Delta 8 10 and other non-9 THCs valuable against PTSD?
Valuable against PTSD. Well, so Delta 8, let's take Delta 8 for example. I think that's the best example because it looks very similar molecularly to Delta 9. It binds to the same receptors as Delta 9. So yes, if we're talking about the molecule in and of itself, not the other things that might be in a Delta 8 product that might be harmful, sure. Right? When we talk about these molecules, we want to apply them to medicine, we're thinking of them at the cellular level. Does the mechanism of action do what we need it to do? So if Delta 8 mimics Delta 9 and Delta 9 is effective in treating PTSD, yeah. I can acknowledge that Delta 8 may be therapeutic. But it's going to come down to, is that Delta 8 product safe? Right? That part. Right? Was it manufactured according to regulation? Did it pass? Yeah. Well, you can do what you want. I don't recommend it. When we're talking about cannabis in commerce, like all of us, if we're going to spend our hard-earned dollars and cents on anything, don't we want that product to be safe and effective? Okay, so let's hold the products that are out here to a higher standard. If we're in community growing for one another, we might be more lenient, right? Because we trust our plug. And I think that's okay too. But even then, I would ask, do you know where this came from? What's in it? Is it laced with anything? Because there is a problem, right? And unlicensed business, the country over, with products that are lacking in integrity.
And we're seeing a lot of that in New York, right? Additional question is...
Well, one more thing on that.
Yeah, please.
If you buy your product from a licensed business, you can hold that business and everybody downstream accountable too, right? You can't do that if you don't know where the medicine came from.
Has there been additional research on endocannabinoids receptors, CB3, CB4, CB5, and suppression? Suppression, I'm not sure I understand that.
And suppression of FA. There's been so much. Yeah, so I took it back, right? 1988 was when we discovered the first receptors. By 1995, we knew about the endocannabinoid system. Since 2011, researchers have been talking about the endocannabinoid dome, like a big kingdom that the endocannabinoid system interacts with. And there are countless receptors, ligands that work on those receptors, molecules that bind to those receptors, and enzymes that play with the endocannabinoid system. I mean, it's pretty exhaustive list at this point, which is really cool, but that makes the science of the endocannabinoid really complex. What I will say is, by your trivia, I don't know if y'all are having an opioid problem like we have everywhere else in the country, but through the endocannabinoid dome, we have recognized like synergy between some of these receptor systems. And the cannabinoids can bind into the opioid receptors, which is really cool too. And in doing so, what we have witnessed, what I had to learn in Oregon, I had to take continuing education credits on this actually, interestingly, is that counter to popular belief, cannabis can help wean people off of opioids because it can bind to those same receptors that opiates bind to. It creates something called synergistic analgesia, meaning that with cannabinoids on board with opiates, right, the pain relief you can achieve is greater than either, taken alone or in like some, one-to-one sum. Cannabinoids on board also help with withdrawal symptoms. So for me, I'm still quite surprised to learn that pain management clinics everywhere are still kicking patients off out of their pain contracts because they use cannabis with their opiates. Scientifically, it doesn't make any sense. Medically, I think it might be even a little bit unethical. But
I know we have a few minutes from concluding, so I won't be able to ask all the questions, but here's another question. I typically smoke cannabis in the evening to unwind. I often find myself falling asleep while watching TV. I am having a sober month now and noticed I suffer from insomnia in the first 2 weeks of sobriety. How do I mitigate this?
Oh, that's a complex. Who are you? Find me afterwards. You know, cannabis is interesting, right? We like to make a lot of generalizations. For those of us still sort of stuck in I think the area of skepticism, headlines around, chronic cannabis use, cannabis addiction, cannabis withdrawal, are really palpable, right? They might make us think that, yeah, cannabis is an addicting substance, it has deleterious consequences, et cetera. Yeah, if you really do misuse. But in the grand scheme of things, things are rare. True addiction is rare, right? Cannabis is not addicting. We have the evidence to prove that too. But can someone who is at risk for addictive behaviors consume it as such? Sure. And we do find that when people go on cannabis fasts, and you can even use that strategically, chronic everyday users can experience withdrawal symptoms. Now, they're not deadly withdrawal symptoms like we find with opiate use. But you can get agitated, you can get headaches, you can get stomach aches. You can have all those things too. There are some terpenes that I would recommend to help combat with some of those experiences. But yeah, I would like to talk to you because I have some questions actually for you that I won't be able to, address.
And the last question is, someone says, I am a social worker, educator who has started their own cannabis social services company. Any advice on what resources I can share with clients? And that's from Taylor Coleman.
Oh, goodness. Cannabis NYC, what kind of resources do you have? Congratulations. For that. Hit the nail on the head, that's where I was going. For folks who are pioneering into the cannabis space, who are literally creating fields that don't exist, like yourself, you gotta join up with other like-minded folks. Many of us, we're all building this plane while flying it, right? That is so true. And there are not enough of us creating the necessary resources fast enough. So with ACHEM, we've brought healers and healthcare professionals of color together to start doing this with one another. And ACHEM is for healers and healthcare professionals. So it's not just medical providers and nurses. We have ministers, we have yogis, we have fitness instructors. Yep, I see y'all. Social workers would fall under that camp. You're welcome to join. We have regular programming, and it's all about enriching us and equipping us with the information that we can take to our communities. We are very proud of the service work that we do. We have a whole, let me just go through our keystones really quick. Let's plug ACHEM, all right? So ACHEM, we fulfill our mission through 4 keystones. The first one's enrichment. We want to educate our members in the science of cannabis, the endocannabinoid system, and in health equity. Our next keystone is promote. Many of us have businesses in this space, and the reason why I was like, we need ACHEM is because I kept on hearing people say, like on stages like this, there's no medical doctors in cannabis, there are no Black medical doctors in cannabis, and I'm like, hello, like, are we invisible? We are invisible, unfortunately, right? And so we really care about creating opportunities with each other, for each other, so that we can advance economically through this space too. The third keystone is participate. We're very active in policy and regulation. We interact with our U.S. Congress people and local representatives everywhere. Again, remember, the reason why I got into this work is because there was nobody like me at the tables where decisions were being made. We need to be there. Healers and healthcare professionals are still held in high esteem in our communities, and we need to lead. And then lastly is serve. Our last keystone is serve. We create the community resources that we know our communities need. And so would love to have you and work with you to create the resources you feel like you need.
We are out of time, Dr. Knox, but Before we wrap up, is there anything else you would like to share with this amazing audience?
Oh, you can find me really anywhere on social. Rachel Doc Knox, Doctors Knox, Rachel Doc Knox. And please follow CHEM, the Cannabis Health Equity Movement. Join our movement. If ACHEM makes sense to you, join ACHEM. You can find that. You can find more information on ACHEM at www.achmed.org. Yeah, maybe that's about it.
Let's give it up for Dr. Knox, everybody.